Imelda Marcos, the wife of the legendary Philippines dictator Ferdinand Marcos, led an official diplomatic visit to Beijing. She met with Chairman Mao Zedong as well as Premier Zhou Enlai. Imelda's visit formally established diplomatic ties between Beijing and Manila. The Chinese government also recognized the military rule of Ferdinand Marcos and agreed not to interfere in the internal matters of Philippines. This was a big coup for the Marcoses. In that visit, there was also a photograph of Imelda and Ferdinand's son, Bongbong, who was 18 at that time, beaming at Chairman Mao. Today, close to 50 years later, Bongbong of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the former dictator, has won a decisive victory in the Philippines elections. It is the first time in 20 years that a candidate has won in the very first round itself. His victory, as controversial as it is within the Philippines, is also going to have major ramifications outside of the islands, particularly in its relations with two great powers, China and the United States. On Crux Decode, how Marcos Jr.'s victory is being cheered in Beijing and greeted with apprehension in Washington. Marcos Jr. has had long-standing ties with China. He is seeking a new deal with Chinese ruler Xi Jinping because both countries have contested waters in the South China Sea. On the other hand, Marcos's relations with the United States have been complicated by a contempt of court order because he basically refused to cooperate with a court of law. Now, back in 1995, this court in Hawaii ordered the Marcos family to pay $2 billion of plundered wealth back to the victims of his dictatorship. The Philippines is at the very heart of the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. The Philippines claims maritime territory, disputed islands basically, called Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands, which China also claims as its own. Now, these waterways are very strategic, they're also resource-rich. More than a quarter of the world's maritime traffic passes through these waters. In 2016, a United Nations tribunal constituted under the international law of the sea ruled in favor of the Philippines, overruling China's claims to these disputed islands. However, China refuses to either acknowledge or even implement this order. In fact, since the verdict, China has doubled down and built military installations as well as landing strips in these disputed islands. And neither the Philippines nor its one-time colonizer, the United States, has been able to stop China from doing all of this. During the election campaign, however, whenever Marcos Jr. was asked about this United Nations verdict, he would say that the ruling was not effective because China did not recognize it. His alternative would be to seek a bilateral agreement with China to resolve their differences. The problem is this: China may not be interested at all in a settlement. They would rather have this dispute being simmered over and over and over. In fact, Marcos Jr. even said in one interview during the campaign that letting the United States into this dispute would mean making China the enemy. He even boasted in that interview about how he had friends in the Chinese embassy in Manila. Now, Antonio Carpio, he's the former Supreme Court judge of the Philippines. He's the guy who led the Philippines legal team at the UN tribunal. He says Marcos's stand on these disputed islands is a betrayal of the Philippines. He says Marcos Jr. has taken the side of China against the Philippines. Bongbong's relations with the United States, on the other hand, are complicated by this contempt of court order. He basically refused to cooperate with a district court in Hawaii. Back in 1995, many of the victims of Marcos Sr.'s rule, who had lost their loved ones as well as suffered physical damages, they sued the Marcos family in the United States. The court ordered the Marcos family to pay $2 billion to these victims. This order has not been fully respected or implemented by the Marcoses. So much so, Marcos Jr. is worried about getting arrested in the United States that he has refused to travel to the US since 1995. Marcos wants friendlier ties with China, but not at the expense of ceding Philippine territory. He may be open to direct consultations, direct bilateral negotiations with China to try and settle the island dispute, but he is willing to explore areas of cooperation with China, including development of natural gas as well as oil in the West Philippine Sea. But there is one thing he cannot afford to do, and that is be seen as losing or conceding territory to China. After all, Bongbong Marcos has cultivated the image of a strong and decisive leader, and such an image would run contrary if he were to compromise Philippines' territorial integrity. Marcos' father, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., ruled the Philippines for 20 years until 1986. He was a close ally of the United States. But he also began engaging with China after diplomatic ties were established in that famous trip, or right after that famous trip, 1974. In 1974, a year before these ties were established formally, Marcos Jr., who was 18 years old at that time, he had accompanied his mother Imelda to Beijing for that historic trip. In fact, one of the video clips from that trip, it shows a beaming young Bongbong Marcos meeting the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. This was the first of many visits that Bongbong has made to China. In fact, in a cable sent to Washington, D.C. back in March of 2007, the US Embassy in Manila had reported that Marcos Jr. traveled frequently to China in 2005 and in 2006 to drum up his many businesses. A month after this cable was written, in 2007, China opened a consulate in Laoag City. Laoag is the capital of the Marcos family's fiefdom. It's in the province of Ilocos Norte, where Marcos was governor. Laoag City has a population of just 100,000 people. This is in a country which has over 100 million people. Laoag City has one of the two consulates in the Philippines that's outside of the capital, Manila. It is kind of odd for a city with just 100,000 people. On the other hand, Marcos has not visited the United States for the last 15 years. Both him and his mother are facing a contempt of court ruling as well as a $350 million fine. That's on top of the $2 billion payout that both him and his mother were ordered to pay by a district court in Hawaii for human rights violations. Now, the lawyer who's been leading this case on behalf of the victims says only $37 million out of the $2 billion has been recovered from the Marcos family. Bongbong Marcos' record victory will be met with disappointment among many folks in Washington. But if he doesn't change the fact that the US-Philippine alliance is more vital than ever before, and the United States continues to work to deepen that relationship, then things would continue to be on an even keel. From Marcos Jr.'s point of view, he would seek to preserve the US alliance, but at the same time, also ensure that his Chinese benefactors are kept happy.